Garland Nixon here with Caleb Mop, and there's a whole lot of craziness going on in this world, and Caleb and I are going to try to straighten it out. Let's talk. Hello, Garland Nixon here, and we're hanging out with Caleb Moppet. Caleb has a great organization. You can find it at cpiusa.org, the Center for Political Innovation. We're going to talk about that a little bit later, but we'll get started off with some of the big news items. We might have to throw a few in there that aren't in the title. Let's start with this. I was watching something online, and I saw. I'll put it like this. I saw a lot of information that said like many thousands, the numbers are going to vary depending on where you hear it, but many thousands of Ukrainian troops are surrounded in one or two spots, right?
Right.
And I thought to myself, okay, you never know. That's what the Russians are saying. And of course, Zelensky says, no, that's just crazy propaganda. Okay, you never know, because I do recall I keep in mind something. All countries do play PR games during war. And I remember the Russians were like, oh, no, there's no North Koreans anywhere near the battlefield, blah, blah, blah. And it ended up there were, and they were playing that game. That's the game, that people play. So I said, well, there could be a lot of troops surrounded. It's possible. Or it could just be Russian propaganda playing. I don't know, right? Here's something that kind of convinced me. So apparently President Putin came out and said, look, we will allow journalists, Western journalists, Ukrainian journalists, any journalists from anywhere in the world to go into those areas that are surrounded. We'll provide an opening for them. We'll guarantee their safety. And they can go in and they can talk to the soldiers and they can come back out. And I thought to myself, I think I believe the Russians now, because that pretty much settles it. Anyway, your thoughts on these, the term they use in the context of Russia, the Russian military, is cauldrons. Caleb Moffat.
Well, there's a lot of things there. First of all, I saw another report that thousands of Ukrainians just left the country. Military-aged young men were just getting out of there. The other thing is that Russia is testing new missiles that are nuclear capable, and they've revealed how strong they are. You almost have to wonder if the reason Trump is playing games, it seems, right? Like, there was this meeting that was, I guess they were saying it was postponed. They were going to meet in Budapest. They called it off. The reason Trump is playing games is because of the fact that Russia is in such a strong position right now that, it's not going to be a situation where Russia is going to have to make huge concessions, and you wonder if that's what's going on. Now, one thing I was here, I'm working here in New York, and I got the call Friday morning. I ran into Manhattan and I met my cameraman, and we got to talk with Kirill Dmitriev, who is the CEO of the Russia Direct Investment Fund. And he was there for a surprise visit, but it was not a surprise to anyone but the public, right? It was planned for months. And even though the Budapest meeting was put on hold or whatever, that meeting went ahead. He said he was in the city to meet with unnamed Trump administration officials. And he said that the negotiations are being stalled by the British. It is the British that are stalling it, and they are putting pressure on the Ukrainians to stall it, basically, and other EU countries, but they're basically taking orders from the British. And then he also emphasized these new sanctions they just hit Russia at. You know who's going to have to pay for it? You and me, when we fill up our gas tank. It's just going to make the oil prices go up, right? And that it's actually hurting American consumers. The gas prices are going up. And then he also then emphasized that it looks like this bridge or tunnel, I guess, under the Bering Sea is more possible than it has ever been because of Elon Musk. Now the technology makes it budget effective in a way. The cost will be maybe a third of what it once would have cost. And he kind of went over the history. He said that they were talking about building it way back in the Tsar's time. And he said the closest we ever came, I didn't know this, was Kennedy and Khrushchev were going to build the Friendship Bridge.
Yes.
Right. So I guess, you have Russia, you have Alaska, and then you have these little islands that are very close, that are just right next to each other. and they wanted to actually build a bridge over those little islands, like symbolic. Kennedy and Khrushchev were talking about building a little symbolic bridge there. But then the idea is to have, a tunnel, like a highway tunnel that would go under the ocean, all the way from Russia to Alaska and vice versa. And it looks very, very possible. And Elon Musk is pumped, and he's drawn up plans. There's all kinds of videos online. And that apparently was a big part of the meeting. So he addressed the press. Really an honor to see him there. So then Sunday, the photos came out. We found out who he was meeting with, and it was Anna Paula Luna. Now, he was a member of Congress from Florida. And she is the one who met with him. And she has now taken charge on Russia peace stuff. You should see her tweets. I mean, she's calling out Zelensky. She's showing polls show the Ukrainians want negotiations now. Zelensky, listen to your people. Your people aren't with you. She's been pushing back. The Democrats have been calling her a traitor and all of this stuff. And she said, I want the same thing Kennedy wanted. I want peace and negotiations with the Russians and all that. Anna Paula Luna has kind of come out swinging as the new voice for peace with Russia. And she met with Kirill Dmitriev. And I mean, he's the rising star, right? He's handling the economic side of the negotiations, right? And so, yeah, it's all very exciting. I mean, we can only hope. But I also think Venezuela is a factor because Venezuela is a Russian-aligned country. And if you're on the brink of attacking Russia's ally, they're not going to sit down and end a war if you're about to start a new one, right? So I think that may also be a factor in stalling all of this. I know that Wagner Group, the military contractors, are in Venezuela, et cetera. So, we just have to see. Now, Tulsi Gabbard has been interestingly silent. She revealed the Russiagate hoax and all of that. Bolton is indicted. Brennan is going to be indicted, it looks like. Congress has asked for his indictment. The DOJ is preparing his indictment. Comey is indicted, and, we're going to have some trials where we hear details about the Russiagate hoax. Tulsi Gabbard, lately, her big thing is she's just talking about how evil these cartels are, right? These cartels that kidnap people and torture people. She's talking about that. She's not speaking up enthusiastically about attacking Venezuela, though. That's Marco Rubio's argument, is, we got to attack Venezuela. Gabbard's not saying that. If you actually listen to what she says, she's saying these cartels that we catch smuggling people into America are bad. That's what she's sticking with, right? That's kind of her talking point. And they bring up Venezuela, and she just kind of, whatever, and she moves on from that. I don't think Tulsi Gabbard supports intervention in Venezuela.
Me neither.
She's not, it looks like that's Marco Rubio's whole heart and soul is in that. So she's not, putting up a big fight and opposing the administration itself. But it's been leaked that Wyckoff is also opposed to intervention. That's been leaked. So, I think there are differences within the administration. We're just going to have to see. Trump right now is at the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit in Seoul in South Korea. And, wild. The South Korean president gave him a crown. Did you see that? He gave him a crown.
Golden crown.
Which, they just had the No Kings rally. So I don't know what he's getting at, giving him a crown there. I don't know what that's about. If that's a subtle dig, or he's saying, hey, it's ironic or whatever. But it's a big crown too, and I guess it's supposed to symbolize the connection between earthly leadership and the heavenly world or something, God's divine right or something. I mean, that was kind of wild, and everyone is holding their breath because Trump is going to meet with Xi Jinping before he leaves town. Right? They are going to have a sit down. The other thing is Trump. There's a recording now of him on Air Force One. Saying that hinting that basically a meeting with Kim Jong-un is going to happen at some point. Now, it's not going to happen at least until the meeting with Xi is over. But whether it happens on this trip or not, it's going to happen. That's basically what it sounded like in the recording. So we're just going to have to see. Trump is playing wild games. Every time, with China, they reached a deal in the summer. It sounded amazing. Everything was fine. And then everything wasn't fine. And then China slapped their restrictions on the rare earth minerals, right? The magnets and the minerals. And so now Trump is really mad about that. And so it's just a game of back and forth, I think. So we're just going to have to see how things go.
A couple of things, and that is and I guess everybody talks about this, but it's something that is of consequence, and that is, the U.S. I said this a while back. There's 3 world powers that are significant, and some, Iran. There are other countries that are significant. Don't get me wrong, but 3 that operate in a sphere of their own, in a level of their own, and that's Russia and China and the United States, right? And Sadly, being an American, the United States decided the other two got to go down and we're going to be the boss, right? But it's a dangerous time because what we're seeing is this, they're going to do this kind of clandestine, underhanded military. There's a saying, let's see, there's another thing in Latin America. I forgot exactly how it goes, but what it means is you throw the rock, you hide your hand, right? You know what I mean? And it is, you take an act and you pretend like you're not the one who did it, And so Trump's like, oh no, we're not trying to take out Russia, the US. We're just standing up for poor little democratic Ukraine. Oh, we're not trying to do anything bad to China. We're just trying to counter them and maintain the status quo and stop them from mistreating democracy. We're playing this game with these other two. But what it has done is it has demonstrated the power of these other two countries. Yeah. And it has demonstrated, to be quite frank, the weakness and the fragility of the really political and to some extent, I'll put it like this, not just the politics, but the political culture of the political class in the West has been exposed to both the people and the rest of the world as really dysfunctional and broken.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's pretty wild, and that the administration is very confused. They don't quite know what to do. They're going one way, they're going another way. Marco Rubio obviously has his long-term foreign policy agenda, and there are different forces pulling the administration in the different way. And those of us who want to make the world a better place, we just have to try and push for whatever good we can get. And I urge people not to moralize it. It's not about good guys versus bad guys. It's about how do you maneuver within all this chaos to try and get some good for the world. And if we can see this war in Ukraine end, that'd be great. If we can see the USA de-escalate and not go in and attack Venezuela, that would be great also. I must say, and this is not being pointed out loudly enough, who is speaking out against the attacks on Venezuela? Rand Paul, Thomas Massey, no Democrats, none, right? AOC, she's supposed to be a socialist, silent on Venezuela. Bernie Sanders, supposed to be a socialist, silent on Venezuela. And Mamdani, who's the so-called socialist running for mayor of New York City, he's gone as far as to call Maduro a dictator, and he's actually supporting the threats against Venezuela. So, I continue. Both sides are deceptive. On the one hand, right, you've got the so-called socialists that are not, supporting Venezuela. On the other hand, a lot of the people on the right that are opposing Venezuela say, oh, Mamdani and AOC and Bernie, they're just like Venezuela. They clearly are not if they want to overthrow Venezuela, and they're supporting threats against it. And the other thing, though, is Rand Paul has been saying, I mean, if you listen to what he's saying, he says it very gently. He's got this very, kind of Southern gentleman kind of, he speaks with his kind of gentlemanly Southern accent, but he's saying some things that should be alarm bells. First of all, these ships that they're sinking, these little boats that they're sinking off the coast of Venezuela, for them to come to the United States with drugs, they would have to stop and refuel like 5 times before they got here, right? Number two, if they were actually full of drugs, they wouldn't sink them. They would seize them as evidence. Number three, one of these boats, they sunk it, and there were 2 survivors. And you know what the USA did? Took them back to Venezuela. Well, if they were drug smugglers, wouldn't they arrest them and take them to court and charge them with being drug smugglers? So they're sinking these boats because they're drug smugglers. And then 2 people survive, and they say, you can go back to Venezuela.
Well, except they couldn't charge them. You know why? Because the evidence is at the bottom of the sea. If they were drug smugglers, they wouldn't have the drugs to present as evidence in court. So they'd have 2 guys. Hey, you guys got a boat full of drugs. Really? Where is it? It's at the bottom of the Caribbean Sea.
Yeah.
But the other part of it is this: if we're honest about it, they don't have any jurisdiction on international waters. I mean, it's all a fraud. Yeah, the whole thing's a fraud. Yeah.
Yeah. Even if they were, we don't have the death penalty for drug dealing in America. I know in Singapore and some countries they do, but even there, you have to go before a judge. You have a trial. There's due process, and like, where does it say in the law if you think someone's a drug smuggler, you can just shoot them? That's just not how. That's not legal anywhere in the world, right? That and so what and JD Vance, his tweets about this, oh, well, they're drug smugglers, we can kill them. It doesn't work that way. And they're changing the goalpost about what drug it supposedly is. First it was fentanyl, and then it became cocaine. And it's like we can't even keep the story straight about what drug it is. I mean, the whole thing is just, it's absurd. But they're moving battleships in there, and Trinidad and Tobago, and all of this. But Colombia says they've got Venezuela's back. They will support Venezuela, which is big because Colombia for years has been the primary U.S. ally in the region. People have said Colombia is like the Israel of South America, right? That's where all these U.S. military bases were in the name of fighting the FARC rebels and fighting drugs. The USA has had a military presence in Colombia for decades. Now Colombia says they will support Venezuela. There's a bunch of Chinese tanks that were delivered there this summer. And there's Chinese fighter jets that have been delivered to Venezuela over the summer. On top of that, now the Wagner Group, the Russian military contractor group, is in Venezuela. They're going to have a fight on their hands. I've said from the beginning of this that there are three possibilities. The first being that we'll see a repeat of what happened in Trump's first term. They'll beat their chest. They'll make a lot of noise about Venezuela, and then they'll back off. That's what happened in his first term. Remember, it really the big thing in the first term is they had the food truck that was going to go over the border to Colombia. And they lit it on fire, and they tried to say Maduro did it, but people were there filming with their phones. They lit their own food truck on fire and then made it go viral that Maduro did it. And so at that point, they were completely discredited, and then they just moved on. And Trump, apparently the quote, according to John Bolton, Donald Trump said, I'm bored with Venezuela. Can we talk about something else? That's what John Bolton says. So, I tend to believe John Bolton. I mean, that's, as far as John Bolton said, that's like a horrendous thing to say. How dare he? We should be focused on overthrowing them. So, John Bolton says Trump got bored. So maybe we'll see that. Maybe after a while, Trump will be bored. We'll move on to something else. That's what I hope happens. Second possibility is airstrikes, which is looking like it very well could happen. They will probably say, oh, these are drug facilities with zero evidence or credibility, and they'll airstrike something in Venezuela. I really hope they don't do that. That would be an awful thing. Civilians would probably die, military people, infrastructure. That would be an awful thing. And I really hope that doesn't happen. The third possibility would be a full-on invasion. If that were to happen, that's World War III, and that's a humanitarian catastrophe. You think we got problems with refugees now? You think we got problems with drug cartels now? That would be an absolute disaster for the entire hemisphere, for the entire world, really. So that third option is a nightmare scenario. So I really hope it doesn't go there. But we shall just see. I maintain that Marco Rubio is a very, very negative force within the administration. I know Scott Ritter has said that as well, that it seems pretty clear that Marco Rubio represents kind of the worst of the Trump administration. Tulsi, in my opinion, represents the best. So we're going to see what happens.
Yeah, Marco Rubio is the Blinken Sullivan of the Trump administration. And there's others along with him. You got Hegseth, who doesn't strike me as, let's just say he's not a strategic mind in the group. Okay, I'll be charitable. He comes across like to be frank, Hegseth to me, and I'm not saying this as an insult. He comes across like not like a high-ranking officer, but like the guy that just came out of the academy that's ready to run through walls and do a million push-ups. The jock in high school that was always walked up and hit a little too hard in the arm. You're like, come on, man, not so hard.
Yeah, right.
But he needed to cheat off of your paper because otherwise he'd fail.
Well, there you go.
That's the way Hegseth comes across,
Yeah, and he's probably been watching a little too much like Andrew Tate kind of Manosphere YouTube content.
Yes,
right? He looks in the mirror while he's lifting, and that's I can totally see that. But other than that, the other thing. So Maduro is now calling for international volunteers, and that's very interesting. People from throughout the region are going to go to Venezuela and fight. There's a whole history that, going back to the Spanish Civil War, the Abraham Lincoln brigades that went to fight Franco in Spain, right? I remember that. That's little side story. I was a 15-year-old kid in a little town in Ohio called Orville. That's where I grew up. It's where Smucker's jelly is made. And I thought, what are the chances? I would Google, were there ever any communists from my little town, Orville, Ohio? And I Googled it, and I found about Carl Geiser. Carl Geiser, who was a captain of the Abraham Lincoln Brigades, was from my little town, Carl Geiser. And he had been a leader of the Abraham Lincoln Brigades. I guess he was a farm kid from Ohio in the 1930s. And he went and studied electrical engineering at Cleveland State University. And at the time, there weren't many jobs for electrical engineers because it was the Great Depression. But the Soviet Union was hiring electrical engineers because they were industrializing. So he went to the Soviet Union, this farm guy from Ohio, and he was blown away by all the rapid industrialization. And he was just really impressed. So he came back to the United States and he joined the Communist Party. And then when they called for volunteers to go fight in Spain, he went and fought in Spain, and he was taken captive by Franco, by the fascists. And then Roosevelt traded him back. There was like a prisoner exchange. So Roosevelt traded him back. And he was, just a hero of the Abraham Lincoln Brigades from my little town in Ohio. And I'll never forget the first time I ever came to New York City. I was a senior in high school. It was 2006, the year I graduated from high school. It was a big anti-war demonstration in Iraq. And I'd never been to the city before or whatever. And I'm walking down the street, and there's all these different people protesting the war in Iraq. It was before Obama got elected. So it was, people were still protesting the war. And I remember we came up to one corner, and there were a whole bunch of old men in wheelchairs, along the side of the street. And they had a banner above them that said Veterans of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade against the war in Iraq. Right. And these were, guys in their wheelchairs, guys in their 80s and 90s who had fought against Franco in Spain as part of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade to, fight fascism in Spain. I thought, wow, that was pretty neat to see veterans of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. And they're not alive anymore. I think the last 5 or 6 years, the Abraham Lincoln Brigades, they ultimately, the last survivor or whatever died. But I think there were like 4,000 or 5,000 Americans that went to Spain to fight against fascism. Yeah.
Well, if you go, when you go to South America, you go to a Nicaragua, or you go to a Venezuela, when there are events and when there are people there, they're people who are socialists and revolutionaries and sympathizers from all over South America that gather to the countries such as Nicaragua or Venezuela that still, have a revolutionary government. And I have to tell you that they've armed a lot of people in Venezuela, millions. And I have to say, I have no doubt that there will be people from all over South America, if the United States gets involved in that fight, coming there, just saying, let me at the gringos, give me a gun. I mean, that, there's no question about that in my mind. Having seen what, how people and they're so excited, and they're talking about the Bolivarian Revolution, how important it is to support Venezuela, through their trials and tribulations. And man, it would be terrible. I mean, with a country that size, you couldn't really, go in. What do we got? 10 or 15,000 people. That's not legitimate to go in against literally millions of partisan fighters. That's what you got. Millions of partisan fighters. And what do they have? At least a couple 100,000 or so in their military, probably.
Yeah, well, and it's a mountainous country too. That's the other thing, right? It's up in the mountains, and the poor people that support Maduro are up in the mountains. When I was there in 2015, I remember the cab driver I had was not a Maduro supporter. He was upset about corruption or whatever, but he said to me, "Oh, Maduro's going to win." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Well, I'll tell you what happens. Every time there's an election in this country, the buses go up into the mountains, and they fill those buses up with poor people, and they just start coming down in droves, and they all just go to the polls and vote for Maduro." And he said that Maduro's going to win. And I was like, oh, okay.
All the poor people support him.
Yeah. No, I mean, when it comes to Latin America, the USA, that's what Obama did, is he kind of changed the way the USA relates to Latin America. When Obama was president, in Honduras and in Guatemala, where my wife is from, they had kind of like fake revolutions almost. And the people kind of rose up against corruption, and they put the former dictator Rios Montt of Guatemala, they put him on trial, for crimes against the indigenous people, for genocide. He was found guilty, but then on a technicality, they let him go. And it was like Obama was very much trying to change who the USA is aligned with, because for the longest time, the USA has been aligned with like the hard right wing, the wealthy landowners and military people in Latin America. Those folks are not popular, and they are quite unfriendly and all of that. I will never forget when I was in college, Lula da Silva was president of Brazil, and there were a number of Brazilian students, wealthy Brazilian students at my college. And so I asked them, what do you think of Lula da Silva? And they said, oh, he's horrible. He's absolutely horrible. Can you believe Brazil? We're a civilized country. This man was a delivery man. He delivered packages for a living. Oh, my God. People think that we're a country of poor people. We've got a delivery man as our president. And I said, well, why does he win the elections if he's so bad? And they said, they said all these poor people vote. They have no business voting. They don't have proper education. They don't know anything. And they're voting. And I said, well, why do they vote for Lula da Silva? And they said, because he gives them all jobs. He just gives them all jobs. And, and it's like they're just so out of touch. And it was so blatantly classist kind of, it was just kind of, and that for the longest time, that was who the United States backed in Latin America. And the reason those people were in power was a lot of these countries were just straight up military dictatorships. And even when they weren't in the rural areas, people didn't vote. The indigenous folks, they didn't speak Spanish. They spoke indigenous languages. They just kind of lived in the villages. They didn't have running water and electricity. In the 21st century, all those indigenous folks started voting. And those folks, vote in their own economic interest, and they outnumber the gentry or the aristocracy, the oligarchy or what have you. And the oligarchy is just so blatantly racist and so blatantly, supremacist, and they're just really unpopular. And so Obama tried to pivot. He no longer was the USA backing those folks. Rather, the USA, they developed kind of a moderate left wing, and that's who the USA has been backing. And that's the government in Chile.
Like a liberal class, to create their kind of liberal class here the neoliberal class. That's still militarily aggressive, pro-corporate, but they try to say they're helping the LGBTQ community or something like that. And then, that's what they're trying to things they're doing. And then they'll have like programs for art or something, but they'll sell your whole country out, into Wall Street, basically.
Oh yeah, exactly. And that pivot, that's kind of why Marco Rubio is, I think, so desperate, because the Marco Rubio crowd has been kind of left out to dry. You listen to a lot of those folks. I mean, Obama, he put Rios Montt, the military dictator, on trial. He arranged for him to go on trial and get called out for committing genocide against indigenous people. Now, they arranged for him to not actually go to prison for it, and then, technicality, we didn't dot the I or cross the T, but they did at least have a big public recognition of the horrendous crimes that Rios Montt committed in the 80s, and that Obama kind of was really trying to appease the Bolivarian, the people who might go over to the Venezuelan side. And that was a really big pivot under Obama. And I mean, the other thing, and that this has been widely pointed out, is, the Noriega, who was the dictator of Panama, the USA put him into power at first because he was anti-communist, right? But then, the way that you maintain, if you're going to maintain a dictatorship, somebody's got to be economically benefiting it, or people aren't going to, you have to hand out the goods. Like South Korea is a great example. Park Chung-hee was the military dictator of South Korea in the 70s, the 60s and 70s. And he handed out the goods. He built POSCO, the state-run steel industry. He built Hyundai, the car industry. He built Samsung. And, he basically had a relationship where he was saying to the United States, look, if we're going to hold off North Korea, you need to let us develop. And Japan was kind of forced by Kennedy and the Johnson administration to lend money. And he used that. He used the government and the military to set up these corporations. And that's why South Korea is prosperous. And that, Noriega was doing a similar thing. He said, look, if I'm going to stabilize Panama against communism, you got to let me build some airports. You got to let me, improve education. And he started doing that. And then, it was the late 80s. Communism was falling. The USA didn't need him anymore. And suddenly he was on the defensive. And then we know that eventually the USA invaded Panama to remove him using the excuse of drugs or whatnot. But that this happens, and that these military dictatorships that the USA tolerated were very expensive. And often they did raise the living standard. Like Marcos in the Philippines, he was an anti-communist military dictator, but he also called out the debt, and he wanted to cancel all the debt of the third world countries. He built a lot of infrastructure in the Philippines, and it was George Soros and those kind of forces that ultimately removed him. And that was an aspect of the Cold War, is the USA would tolerate these kind of nationalist leaders who were against communism but believed in economic development. Now they don't. Now it's, our way or the highway, and you impoverish your country and sell it off to the highest bidder, or we get rid of you. And a lot, especially in Asia, right? A lot of those governments, like Myanmar, was an anti-communist military dictatorship that pivoted into the side of China because China gives them a better deal economically. And originally the USA set them up to oppose China, But then in the 80s and 90s, the USA started opposing them with the color revolution thing, and they made a deal. And now China and them have a very close relationship. And now Myanmar is pretty solidly in the Chinese camp. And that there's examples of this, of these kind of nationalistic governments. I mean, you can even compare it to like how like Viktor Orban in Hungary, his whole career is hating Russia, right? Blaming Russia for all their problems. Hungary, it was the communists, it's Russia who messed up everything. But now that he's in power, he says, we don't really get anything as a country by hating Russia. Let's not go along with this. It's not in Hungary's interest. Even though his whole background as a Hungarian right-wing nationalist is hating Russia, he's just nationalistic enough. He says, okay, maybe I can beat my chest against the Soviet Union, communism bad, whatever. But now let's trade with them. Let's do business. No, we don't want to go along with the NATO thing. So I think it's very interesting how all of this plays out. You know, it's almost like, you know, during the Cold War, the debate was, are you for the communists or are you against them? Right. That was the terms of the argument. Right. And all kinds of people that didn't agree with America on this or that, radical Muslims and social democrats and military dictators and all kinds of people were against communism. So they were in the US camp. Now it's flipped. Now it's, are you for America or are you against them? Right. And so now all kinds of people that in the Cold War would have been on the side of the United States that hate communism and all of that. Now they're aligning with Russia and they're aligning with China because they don't want all that chaos the USA brings into countries by destabilizing and overthrowing them. It's kind of the reverse. And now it's the Western system. It's on the defensive. That's what Putin said at the UN a couple of years back. He said, the Soviet Union learned you can't spread your system all over the world. Well, now America's got to learn the same thing. If you try to spread your system all over the world, people are going to reject it.
Yeah, I think you're right. And let's talk about this a little bit. So one of the things that's happened with Trump in China is, you know, a meeting with Xi Jinping. I saw something online today, news, and they said Chuck Schumer and other members of Congress are saying to Trump, do not negotiate anything on Taiwan, and basically don't drop any of the things, you know, the restrictions on chips and things like that we're doing to, quote, counter China. Don't do any of that stuff. In other words, don't give China anything that they, you know, may be asking for, right? And I thought to myself, good. Then you know why? Because then China will say, well, you know, I kind of worry about those rare. Not that I don't know that China's going to ever give us the rare earths again. And if I were them, I would not. As long as you presented any military threat to me, there's no way in hell I'd sell them to you. But at any rate, so what's interesting is how the Congress has like become the legislative branch has become the most hawkish branch. They're super hawked. And I think part of that, to be quite frank, is the influence of AIPAC, because bringing in people who are diehard Zionists, I mean, pretty much to be a diehard Zionist, you got to be a neocon. You got to really be a pro-war person to be a diehard Zionist. And I think part of the influence of AIPAC ensuring that members of Congress were Zionists also ensured that we were going to get the most rabid hawks that you could get, right? That just is the way that played out. But at any rate, so they're basically saying to Trump, don't give the Chinese anything. The problem is Chinese got a lot of horsepower now. You know, there was a time when we could go bargain with people like that. Well, we're not going to give you this and that, but we're going to China hat in hand. Duran hat in hand, shall we say, right? We're going to China saying, hey, we need this, this, and this. And to go there and say, oh, by the way, we're not dropping anything again. And Taiwan will load them up with arms. And China, if I were China, just say, hey, look, you wanted to meet with me. Have a nice day. You don't have to do any of that stuff. Don't worry about it. We're all good. But you're not getting these things, and you probably still won't get them anyway. Anyway, Caleb, your thoughts on what that means and our bargaining power and how that reflects the power dynamics amongst superpowers today.
Well, first of all, when it comes to the rare earth minerals, China, you just have to give them points. They are ahead of the game. They are way ahead of the game. I mean, it's not a matter of they scooped them all up, you know, in the last year. They've been thinking about this for years in advance. They've known that certain minerals that used to be completely worthless, certain rare earth elements that had no value before, that were just completely worthless, are now very, very valuable because of computer chip technology and because of the advances. And they have made sure that they have access to those minerals. And they have said, basically, we're going to restrict the export of these minerals. You have to get a license. You have to get special permission to export them. because the USA is waging a trade war against us. So we're going to use that as a bargaining chip. As you know, we have all these minerals, and if you want to get them, you got to talk to us, and you got to, treat us better, basically. And I mean, look, they're ahead of the game, right? I mean, the USA dominates the international oil markets. Well, China's thinking ahead. They're thinking past oil, and they're thinking in terms of computer chips. And I think they're also ahead when it comes to electric car batteries, too. I think they're ahead on that. And look, they're just ahead of the game. And we have export controls on all kinds of stuff, right? All kinds of stuff. And China's policy for the longest time has been, all right, just whatever, do business with us, whatever. We're not going to touch this. Well, they decided to play hardball. They said, okay, you're going to be unfriendly to us. We're going to push back. And, the way the USA has treated China on the chip industry, like if you actually look at the details of it, some of the stuff that the US Congress has said and done is so ridiculous, right? There was, I think 2 or 3 years ago, China was going to build a factory in China to make computer chips, not for export, but for China. And the US Congress, on the floor of Congress, they condemned this and they put new sanctions on China. Whose business is that? If China wants to make computer chips in China for China, they weren't even going to export them, for goodness sakes. Like that's not our concern, right? But they're just so angry. I mean, it's like, again, Lenin wrote that book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. Imperialism is capitalism in its monopolistic stage, right? With no competition. Big corporations based in the Western countries say no one's allowed to compete with us. We just aren't allowed to have competition. Well, I mean, countries are going to rise up from poverty and they're going to compete with you. So I look at China and I think, they got to play hardball. I mean, that's what they're going to do. And I will say, I do find discourse around China on the one hand to be very frustrating, but on the other hand to be hilarious. Because first of all, if you ever point out that China has been wildly successful, 800 million people lifted out of poverty, people say, oh, that's just because they're capitalists now. That's just because they're capitalists now. And I think about that and I say, you got 50% government ownership of the industries, right? You got 5-year economic plans. You've got a Marxist, Leninist, Communist Party in power. And even private companies have no rights. The government comes in and tells them what to do all the time. But that's capitalism. But then those same people will turn around and tell you Obamacare is communism, right? And you're just like, wait a second, right? China's more free market than it was in the 50s and 60s. And, they needed to adjust, right? The Soviet Union obviously needed to adjust. They weren't able to bend, so they broke. But, the argument that, well, China's only doing that better now because they're capitalist. It's like, wait a second, last night it was really cold in my bedroom. So I turned on the heat, I turned on the heat to make it more comfortable. So therefore, I should light my bedroom on fire because more heat is always the answer. Therefore, I mean, that proves it, right? That obviously they needed to adjust and have market mechanisms. It's still a heavily state-run economy. It's still very much a planned economy and all of that. But the people who you'll point to their success. Oh, it's just because they're capitalists. It's just like, wait a second. But then the other thing is whenever China does anything that we're told they're bad, well, that's because they're communist, right? So it's like they're communist when they're bad, they're capitalist when they're good. It's like we don't even really know what to think of it. I think that all of this is actually really relevant in light of Mamdani and all of this, because people have no idea what socialism and capitalism are, right? It's like you either get the old, socialism is when the government does it, which that's not the case. There's always been government involvement. The U.S. Constitution says we should have a post office in it. I think Benjamin Franklin said 2 things in life are inevitable: death and taxes. So I guess, taxes are inevitable.
And let's not forget the general welfare clause in the Constitution.
Yeah. So, in every capitalist country, the government paves the roads, the government maintains a postal service. There's some state involvement, some redistribution of wealth in every capitalist country. And then you get people that say, well, socialism is worker cooperative enterprises. Well, and then, capitalists are the first to point out you have the right under the free market to set up a worker cooperative enterprise. There's no law against it, employee stock ownership program or whatnot. The difference between socialism and capitalism is profit in command. Right? Frederick Engels, he wrote about, under capitalism, the means of production only function as preliminary transformation into capital. Stuff gets done because investors get a return on their investment, right? Shareholders make money. The reason, that buildings are built, the reason that products are produced, the reason that economic activity takes place is to maximize profits for owners. That's capitalism. Socialism is when you have production upon a predetermined plan. When society as a whole takes control of the economy and says, no, we're not going to have profits in command. We're going to make the economy work for the benefit of everybody, right? That's what socialism is. It is the elimination of the anarchy of production. That's the phrase that Marx used, the anarchy of production, or the chaos of the market. We're not saying no more profits in command. Instead, we're going to organize the economy to serve the people. And it's not a matter of, giving people stuff. And it's not a matter of workers owning the private business they work at. It's a matter of central planning. China is very much a centrally planned economy. And I will add that the rate of state ownership in China is way higher than Venezuela. I would maintain they're both a socialist country, but in Venezuela, really their economy is centered around oil. Oil is government run. And with the oil revenue, the government sponsors a lot of private businesses. It builds a lot of infrastructure, and their economy is centered around oil. And so it's really a state-run economy because all the money coming in comes from the oil. Whereas in China, you have a lot of state-run industries, state-run banks. A great example of this, 2015, the Chinese stock market crashed. It went down 60 points in one day. And they were saying it's the end of China's economy and all of that. And we all know if the American stock market went down like that, food would stop getting delivered, the electricity would go off, like there'd be riots in the streets. It would be like Armageddon scenario. In China, nothing happened because most of China has nothing to do with the stock market, right? Very few, there's a lot of foreign people invested in it. There's a lot of rich people invested in it. But then when the stock market crashed, what did they do? The Chinese government said no short selling. If you're caught betting that a stock will go down, you get taken away in handcuffs, right? And they froze the selling of stock of any state-run industry. And the next week, within 5 days, the Chinese stock market was even higher than it had been before because the government just stepped in and said, nope. And so on top of that, when they had their crash, most of society wasn't affected because most of their economy is not connected with the stock market. And even the stock market itself was basically told by the government, no, you got to fix this. And then it went back up. And I wrote an article in 2015 at the time. I said, this was the collapse that never happened. Right. I mean, that they were saying, oh, this is the end. 2015, it was the end. And then the government just said, no, it's not. And China just came right back. I mean, that is not the chaos of the market. That's not profits in command. That's state central planning. And that is socialism. And that there's, income inequality. There's a lot of billionaires in China. I think every day another Chinese person becomes a millionaire, according to the statistics I heard. I mean, they've got, almost 1 billion people, I think 1 billion people in the country. So, that's a lot of people, but, there's a lot of income inequality. Is there corruption? China has problems for sure, but they're not capitalist in the sense that the market is what drives production. They have a government that comes out of an anti-colonial revolution that fought the Japanese invaders that controls and plans the economy.
Well, and the other part of it is this, that what capitalism is in the West, that is even further from its original, from where it started, its early stages, is it's financialized capitalism. And so no, fat capital runs everything. And when I mean everything, when I say everything, I mean the government, so wherein there they make things. With Russia, they make things. They have a heavy industrial base and they have commodities, and there's production of tangible items. Here it's strange financial tools that they make up that you never heard of before, that they need new words for, and new acronyms, asset-backed securities.
Yeah, fictitious capital.
Yes,
term that gets used, right? Of wealth that is not generated to any actual increase in production, living standards, or whatever, and that's in the lead up to the 2008 financial crisis. The stock market, it was all tied in, the market was going up and all this money was being made, but actual conditions in the country were getting worse. The rate of household debt was going up, living standards were going down, the price of college was going up. I mean, Americans were getting poorer and poorer and poorer, but there was this like gambling casino where the rich people could just keep getting wealthier and wealthier and wealthier, but their money was worthless paper. It wasn't based on anything, right? And it's interesting because every major religion in history, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and even like other faiths, has forbidden usury, right? Which is the lending of money at interest. And if you can read old Catholic, documents about this. Why? Because usury is money that is created by having money. no real value is created in the process, right? It's just money made from other money. When you have a group of people who make money by having money, that pretty soon they become exponentially richer than everybody else. And pretty soon the government is in debt to them. And pretty soon they have all the power. And on top of that, there's ways for them to make money. And actually, the poorer the nation gets, the wealthier they are, because the poorer everybody is, the more deeper in debt they're going to be. Right. And so the wealth of the richest people is not connected to the wealth of society increasing. It causes all kinds of distortions. And that's why there was a ban on that. And that there was a feeling, especially around the time the country was founded, there was a lot of people in Europe that they were okay with banking if it was done by the state. The idea of a national bank. Right. And I think that's Alexander Hamilton. His notion was we'd have a national bank that would lend money to stimulate the economy based on kind of a consensus about what was good for the country. But we got rid of our national bank in America. We have a private banking system, and it's just bankers want to get a return on their investment. That's all there is to it. And so we now have this fictitious economy, this economy of fictitious capital.
Absolutely. So let me ask you this. Let me get some predictions from you. Your thoughts on the Trump-Xi meeting. It seems to me that he's being pushed by the legislative branch to play hardball. But, it's like you're going in to play poker and somebody's saying, yeah, give it all you got. You just lay it on the line and you're looking, you got like a few chips like that. And the other guy's carrying like a Santa Claus bag of chips over his shoulder. They can tell you to go in there and give this guy hell, but you got to be real. You got to be very judicious with how you lay your chips on the table. Right. So he's being, I'll put it differently. It seems to me that Congress hasn't grasped just how much economic power China and Russia and these other countries have, and just how little leverage we have over them, which is little, in some instances, none. And in comparative, they can crush us like a flea. If I keep saying China should simply say, we will no longer bargain with you for rare earth minerals. We will not provide them. Any military objects that you need to buy with rare earth minerals, you're going to have to find a way to get them other than through China.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it looks like, the USA wants to play hardball with China. China's going to play hardball back. And that, it's interesting because if you watch Chinese media, they really go out of their way to be non-confrontational. I mean, RT very much, they talk about controversies and scandals and things like that. But you watch Chinese media, it's very chill. They talk about cultural stuff, the history of noodles, and, they talk about new swimming pools opening and art galleries. And they do, I will say, Chinese media does have a lot more coverage of the developing world, right? News from countries on the African continent and in Asia that we don't see in Western media. You don't see on CNN. But really, the Chinese media strays. They avoid controversy. Their attitude is just win-win. Let's just try to focus on, they obviously believe in economic growth and development. But they don't get into, anti-Trump protests. They don't get into, when it comes to controversies and they really try to avoid controversy. That's just not China's approach. Really, since about 1976, but maybe even earlier than that, China's approach has been, and their official line has been, class struggle outside of our own borders is none of our business. That's been their position, right? And that rather, we are just focused on bringing the world together with trade. And that is their focus. So the fact that China is having to play hardball, this is not their natural approach, right? This is not the way they would normally handle these kinds of situations. And it makes you wonder, I mean, if China is continued to push, they're going to keep playing hardball. And, how many cards do they have up their sleeves that they've just been kind of sitting on? One thing that I heard is, you remember in 1999, Bill Clinton bombed Serbia. And he intentionally blew up the Chinese embassy in Serbia. And he said it was an accident. And then WikiLeaks finally proved it was not an accident. They did it completely on purpose. Well, after they did that, the next day, Times Square in New York City was a sea of red. It was a sea of Chinese flags. Tens of thousands of Chinese people from all over the United States piled into Times Square. You couldn't go an inch. Times Square in New York City was just drowning in Chinese flags. And the media and everyone was like, where did all these people come from? And these are not people that are out there saying, go China, that are out there criticizing the United States. They're generally silent. But every so often, it gets to be something so egregious, like, the USA blows up the Chinese embassy. At that point, they are awakened. And China, it's like they rarely call out their troops. They rarely do stuff. But when they do stuff, it's a really, really, really big deal. Right. And it's like, it's a lot more than we knew they were capable of. Right. The only Chinese military overseas intervention that's happened in the last 50 years was the invasion of Vietnam. Do you remember this? 1978. And that was a really, really big deal, that China was aligned with Pol Pot in Cambodia, and Pol Pot was fighting with Vietnam. And one day Deng Xiaoping said, you know what, we're going to move in. And I think the language he used, he said, we're going to teach them a lesson. And everyone was shocked, and it was really quick. It was fast, but all of a sudden China moved into Vietnam, and Vietnam and China clashed. And it was a dramatic move, and everyone was very, very shocked. No one saw it coming. And it was very, very dramatic. And that's the only intervention they've done. I tell people, who's a real threat, right? So China has one overseas military base. One. It's in the African country of Djibouti. Russia has 8 overseas military bases. How many does America have? At least 800, possibly over 1,000. So who's really the threat to the world? Whose military is all over the world? It's not China. It's not Russia. But, before you mentioned that Russia and China and America were like all in the same league, it's interesting. America, Russia, and China, they're not nation states in the way that like France or Germany is. They're a new type of government that you can call a civilizational state, right? And this is a new part of discourse where, it's like, America, what is our American nationality? There's not one American language. There's not one American culture. And the same in Russia. There's a lot of different nationalities. Same in China, right? But civilizational states are held together by an idea rather than by a nationality. And I think that's very, very interesting, that America, there are certain ideas that we have here, the free market and certain principles, etc. And China, you could say it's held together by an idea. China is an idea. Russia, Great Russia, you can call it Great Russia, is an idea. And I think that's very, very interesting, and that we're very much in the era, the era of nation states. That was the 1800s. That was the Treaty of Westphalia and all that. We're in the era of civilizational states.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. I never thought about it like that, but you're right. They are something different, particularly with the reach now of the U.S. empire and the potential reach of all countries, because traditionally they were regional powers, and many of the so-called empires over the course of time were regional empires. But at that time, when they couldn't access, the Western Hemisphere and things like that, or maybe didn't know about certain areas, then things were very, very different as far as how big they could grow and how fast they could travel to go to the outer reaches of the empire. It could only be but so big, because it's a long ways on horseback, or camel, or whatever the case may be. But now and what's interesting too, Caleb, is the self-vassalization, really, of the European political class. I think the people of Europe have national pride. They have some cultural pride. They're proud of being Europeans or Frenchmen or Germans, whatever the hell they are. They're proud of being that. And you have a political class that is fully globalist, neoliberal. There's no borders to them. And it's interesting to see what these states in Europe have become. They've become less than. They've become like, just completely vassalized, and like they come to Trump calling him daddy, gathering around him. I was embarrassed for these countries that they had leaders that were pathetically subservient.
Well, and, in France, you got Nicolas Sarkozy is in jail now because he allegedly got a campaign contribution from Gaddafi. In Germany, they keep talking like they're going to outlaw the Alternative for Germany party, the AfD. They haven't actually done it yet, but they're basically talking about making it illegal because they're afraid they might win an election. And in some countries like Romania, they just cancel the elections if it looks like the pro-Russian party is going to win. I mean, they really don't have sovereignty. They don't have freedom. We saw what happened in Slovenia and other places. I mean, it's getting pretty blatant. The European mainland, when you talk about the European mainland and the resentment that they have against America and Britain, right? That is the oldest geopolitical story. That's World War I. That's World War II, right? You watch the old movie Reds, the Warren Beatty movie. At one point, they ask Warren Beatty's character, they say, "Can you explain World War I?" And he said, "Yeah, America, Britain, and France own the world, and Russia and Germany just want to, or Germany and Austria just want a piece of it." And that was really what happened, is that America and Britain and France were colonizers and imperialists first. Germany didn't really come into existence as a nation, until very late in the game. And so they were trying to catch up and being a colonizer, and they came into confrontation with the Americans and the British and with the French. And you had World War I, and it was the Atlanticists, America and Britain, and their control of the ocean versus the European mainland countries, Belgium and Austria and Germany, and it was a confrontation. And that oil, it became very, very important, right? Especially as technology developed, and the British and the Americans, that we control the oil. And Russia had oil too. Azerbaijan was really, really important. That was where some of the most important oil was. The Rothschild family owned a lot of oil wells in Azerbaijan. Oil was very, very key, and the British and the Americans controlled the oil. So after World War II, Germany was stripped of its colonies. It was forbidden from having its own military, and it was doing very, very badly economically. And, there was a big communist party there. The biggest communist party outside the Soviet Union at that time was in Germany. And it looked like the Germans were suffering enough that Germany might go communist. And so the British were giving covert support to various anti-communist street fighting groups. And one of those was the Nazis. And then, when it became clear the communists might take over, the Nazis, who were getting funded by the British, sat down with Hjalmar Schacht, who was a German banker. And they said, look, it's either us or the communists. And so Schacht went around to all the rich people, and he took Hitler to the dinner parties and all of that. And he said, this is our guy. Hitler came into power, and Germany, they built their own army again, and they started trying to re-seize their colonies. And so then you had World War II. And that even after World War II, that banker, Hjalmar Schacht, who was the banker who was responsible for Hitler, his obsession was the fact that the Germans, their economic future is not tied in with America and Britain, right? And that there has been tension. And a big part of it has been nuclear power. The French love nuclear power, right? The French nuclear energy program, it was started by the government. France, not only do they have nuclear power there, they export it to a bunch of different European countries. They have the nuclear power in France, and they give it to other places. And when Saddam Hussein in the early 80s was trying to set up nuclear power, France went to Iraq and they set it up. They were setting up nuclear power in Iraq. And then Israel, with the permission of the United States, bombed Iraq and killed not only a bunch of Iraqis, but a French scientist, right? And killed him, to prevent Iraq from having peaceful nuclear energy. And France, held a grudge about that. And France maintained a friendly relationship with Saddam Hussein and with Iraq up until the invasion. You remember Jacques Chirac was getting up and condemning it, and there was freedom fries and all of that. The other thing is that, that the main opposition to nuclear power has come from oil companies. Oil money funds a lot of the environmental activism. And one big environmental activist group that gets a lot of money from big oil and all that is Greenpeace. And France, they were going to, test nuclear weapons in the Pacific. And they had, Greenpeace had some activists on a boat, and the French sunk it, and they killed some Greenpeace activists. You remember this? 1985, the French intelligence services went and assassinated a group of Greenpeace activists because they said they want, they believe in their nuclear energy program, and they didn't like these environmental activists messing with it. It was a very big scandal. I think the ship was called the Rainbow Warrior. It was like an environmental ship, and they sunk it. They killed everybody on it, American citizens. And that what's underlying this is the resentment of the European mainland against Britain and America. And that many geopolitical strategists have always said that if the Germans and the Russians teamed up, if that were to happen, the British would lose their control of the European mainland. They'd be out of the picture. That point, if Russia, the Eurasian superpower, and the NATO countries of the European mainland, France and Germany, if they were together at that point, that would be the end of British and American dominance of the world. That's something they're just never going to let happen. That's why Biden blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. You remember that? It seems like the world has just kind of forgotten about that. And, you look at that, it's just so blatantly illegal. You cannot blow up infrastructure. But on top of that, it was an environmental disaster. These are the green people, right? And, you blow up a natural gas pipeline. The amount of pollution that comes out of that is like catastrophic. It's absolutely ridiculous. And it's very clear that the U.S. government blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. I mean, it's very obvious. They threatened to do it. They said they would do it. They did it. People were on Twitter thanking them for doing it. So, all of these, this is geopolitics, right? That's an increasingly interesting school of thought. During the Cold War, the focus was economics, American imperialism versus communism. But now there's a lot of talk of geopolitics and how land masses and territories, your relationship with the land affects culture and civilization, and how different countries battle against different countries. Geopolitics is a particularly interesting school of thought, right? The first book of geopolitics was written by Alfred Mahan. It was called The Role of Sea Power in History. And this was an American naval general who argued that the best way to dominate the world was to have a navy. You had to have a strong navy, and that if you controlled the sea, you controlled the world. And the British got their hands on that book, and they circulated it. The Germans got their hand on that book, and they circulated, and it was sea power is the way to dominate the world. And that became the mode of thinking of the British and the Americans and the Western countries in general. It was the first kind of text of geopolitics. But now you have this rising school of thought, of Eurasianism, right? And that, you have different thinkers. You got Alexander Dugin in Russia. You've got, different thinkers in China and others. And that, they're arguing that their culture and their history is very much tied on to the fact that they're on the great world island, the great land mass of Eurasia, and that cultures that develop on the land are more collectivist in their nature and more focused on economic development. And I think this is all very, very fascinating. There's a lot of deep answers there that, we may not get clear understanding of for maybe thousands of years. And maybe we're just looking at kind of obscure abstract patterns. But I always think of that movie that came out during World War II, classic Russian film. Sergei Eisenstein was the director, Ivan the Terrible. It's a movie about a great czar, Ivan the Terrible, who united all of Russia. Right. And that he's kind of a nice guy, but he learns that if he's going to unite all of Russia, he's got to be ruthless. And so he gradually becomes kind of ruthless, but it's kind of for the good of the nation. And Stalin, oversaw the direction, and they made that movie during World War II. And it's not a very communist movie. I mean, it's got a whole lot of Russian Orthodox prayer. It's glorifying a great czar, but it's kind of sending the message that we're better when we're together. Right. And that sometimes keeping this landmass together comes at great cost. And, you kind of, it comes at great cost and all of that, but it's worth it because we've got to be together. That's kind of the message of the film. And that speaks to a lot. In China, there's this huge admiration for the Qing dynasty, the first dynasty to unite all of China. So again, this is something that, we have to understand, that the way we've been trained to see things in America, that's just the rest of the world isn't like this. You can't put Russia and China into political boxes. You can't say, well, Russia's like Republicans. No, they're not. China's like Democrats. No, they're not. It's so much different than that. These are different civilizations and different cultures with just a completely different background and a different understanding of how to relate to things. The more we know, the more we realize that we don't know.
Yeah, I think I certainly agree with you. Well, thank you very much, Caleb. We've pulled off an hour. Tell everybody where they can find your stuff.
Sure. Center for Political Innovation, cpiusa.org. We're going to have a reception in New Jersey, a really nice conference coming up January 11th. It's really always a pleasure to stream with you, Garland. You are full of great questions and insights. We observe the same events and we pay close attention to this. And you and I, we bounce off each other, and there's just something golden about these interactions. So thank you very much for inviting me on your show. And my channel loves you. I got to tell you, you're wildly popular on my channel. So I look at the chat. I can see that your folks like me too. So always a pleasure. And thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, we always have a great time together. We've been friends for a lot of years. Thanks a lot, everybody. Hey, don't forget, everything's going across the bottom there. And do me a favor. I get letters from people. Let me know. Put a note on there that says it's okay for me, if it's okay for me to mention your name or mention your letter, because sometimes when people send stuff to my PO box, you don't just want to say their names on the air or whatever. So if it's okay, put it on the letter that it's okay, and I'll thank you on the air. Or some of the letters are pretty interesting. I'd like to comment on some of the theories and things that people send me. At any rate, thanks a lot, everybody. Share this on all your social media platforms. Make sure you get over and check out Caleb's channel and subscribe over there. And of course, go to cpiusa.org and see if maybe it's something you'd like to be a part of. We're out.